Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on in Unit 6, Industrial and Economic Development. In our last couple of units, in the last couple of our discussions we were talking about some different theories on why stores and industries might locate themselves where they do. And today we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about this idea of development and where does it come from, how do we measure development, and what exactly is it that we mean when we talk about this idea of development. So I'm going to talk about under the heading of current industrial patterns, because this is really the most important element of this discussion, is that after we get done talking about what is development, we want to look at the spatial distribution of this idea of development, which of course is geography, so that really is most of what the class is all about. So one of the questions that geographers and those who concern themselves with these ideas look at, and one of the things they're concerned about, and we've talked a little bit about this previously in the classes, there's a noticeable difference in the development of certain parts of the world, and you've noticed that certain parts of the world have developed faster over time. They're more developed than other countries in the world, and they've grown richer, faster than other parts of the world. If you think about, again, that idea of core, semi-periphery, and periphery, that's where a lot of individuals will point to, talk about the dependency theory, things like that. But if we look at development, we've noticed over the past several hundred years, certain parts of the world have developed much more quickly than others, and they have reached higher levels of development. So when we talk about development, what exactly it is, here's a textbook definition: defined as the process of improving the material condition of people through the growth and diffusion of technology and knowledge. So notice that we're talking about the improving material condition of people. So that's going to be an important element concept. And so, of course, a lot of that idea of improving material condition of people is going to deal with economic improvement, because as the economy improves, typically the material condition of people will improve. And so the economic improvement is going to be an important piece of that. And so the question is always, well, how is it that certain parts of the world are able to develop while others are not? And that's where you get the different theories, like the dependency theory. Like the self-sufficient, you get the ideas of the self-sufficiency approach, and this idea of the global economy and interconnectedness, and so that's always you have the question, why is it the case? And then once you figured out why it's the case, then you try to ask yourself, well, what can we do in order to improve it, in order to make it better? I think it's important to understand that everywhere in the world is at some level of development. So we are categorizing countries based on levels of development. If we understand the level of development that a country sits in, we typically understand a lot about the things that are going on in the country generally. We give it some general understanding. We may not know specifically what's going on or why things are the way they are in the country, but we can generally understand the conditions that the country finds itself in, the people find itself in, what the economy looks like, things like that. So when we talk about the classification, we've talked about this before, how we as humans love to classify things. We have to break things down and put it into categories. So typically, and for the purposes of this class, most of the time we talk about more developed countries, less developed countries. Others might look at, if you look at like Hans Rosling, he's not real thrilled with the idea of more developed, less developed. He sees you have like more developed and then developing countries, and he doesn't even really like that if you look at some of his videos and talks. We also, some people classify it as developed, developing, and least developed. So again, this idea of core, semi-periphery, and then periphery countries. And when we look at the classification of development, we're going to look at the official classification of development. What's going to happen is people who collect data on this and create these classifications are going to look at social data. They're going to look at demographic data, or health trends and things like that. And they're going to look at economic data, because essentially the idea is these three areas encompass what it means to progress as a society and to progress as individuals within that particular society. Now at this point, we're going to talk specifically about what's called the Human Development Index, developed by the United Nations. Now, the United Nations developed the Human Development Index, and I apologize for the redundancy. I don't mean to be repetitively redundant. Anyhow, so the United Nations created the Human Development Index. Essentially, the idea is you're trying to quantify the idea of development. You're trying to take some intangible, not really intangibles, but some of these fuzzy notions of development, and then bring it down, boil it down to a number, so that we then can compare levels of development across the world to see, if these are the things we're trying to achieve. Look at Norway, which has the highest HDI ranking of any country. Look, what is Norway doing, and how can we help less developed countries replicate that idea so that we can bring them along in development? Because that's really the whole concept, is that we're in this globalized world. We should be looking to help each other and pull each other and pull countries out of poor conditions, and really just kind of it helps the whole world is the whole idea. And it's part of the human condition. We have concerns for humans as individuals, as people, because of the fact that they are people, and so if we can do things to help them improve their lot in life, then we should. So again, it's used to compare development. Take these ideas, boil it down, make it quantifiable so we can study it, so that we can figure out how we can make improvements. So the United Nations is going to compare 4 areas of a society, and this is just for the Human Development Index. They have all other forms of indices, and we'll look at that in just a second. But they look at the life expectancy, and that's kind of your demographic or health focus. You have your average education. So average education is, you look at the population and what is the average number of years a person spends in school. So again, that is a social indicator. The next one is expected years of schooling, which is another social indicator. And those two are going to be combined to give the education indice, or the education indicator. And so the expected years of schooling is the idea that if you're a part of that country, where the expected number of years you could, what are the number of years you could expect to be in school as a part of that society. And the last one we have is what's called the GNI per capita, or the gross national income per capita. So this is our economic indicator. And so if you go to the human development, if you go to the United Nations website, you can find the human development reports. And so you have these tables here, and you'll notice that it's divisible. We're talking about percentages here. And so obviously a 1 would be a perfect score, and not even Norway has a perfect score. But you see these various indicators, and it's a formula that it's more complicated than I am able to understand. And so it's an algorithm that's put together, and it spits out this indice right here. And so of course the closer you get to 1, the higher your ranking. And so you can go through this whole list of countries, and you can look at their ranking, you can look at their scores in various areas. And one of the things I'll point out is that whereas we typically either break the world down to 2 categories, more developed, less developed, the United Nations actually, or 3, developing, less developed, and then more developed, or developing, less developed. The United Nations actually breaks it down into 4 categories. You have very high human development, you have high human development, medium human development, and then low human development. And so you'll notice how they break it down that way. And so there's your table, and you see the different indicators here at the top, and you can back it up. And then if we move from our data to our reports, we can look at some pretty interesting charts and graphs and things, and this is pretty interesting to look at. And you can see the correlation between things like the Human Development Index value, and then first thing we're going to look at is the GNI per capita. So that would be the income index. And so it gives you a nice chart or graph here that shows you there's a nice positive correlation between the greater the income of the country, or the higher the score on the income index, the further down the human development, is going to be. And I guess this is in 1980, and so we could push play. Oh, look at that! That's real nice. That even gives us even more of a linear look statistically, much tighter fit. Hey, that's real great. Nice. I didn't even know that was there. They must have stolen a page out of Hans Rosling's book. Oh, interesting here is you'll notice that whereas previously 1980 we had some countries down here in this bottom left-hand corner, pretty much every country has moved here to the right, which is good, because that means we're getting higher levels of human development around the world, and that's what we'd like to see. We'd like to see that the world as a whole is progressing and moving on, and so that's a real positive thing for us. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the economic indicator. And I apologize for putting it in reverse order, but that's just how it goes sometimes. So the first thing is what's called the gross national income. So if you're in economics class, you might have heard of GDP, gross domestic product. So what gross national income does, it gets a little bit closer to the idea of income per person. It's not exactly the same as income per person. It's more along the lines of wealth created by individuals. But you'll notice here it provides two things. You're looking at the domestic and the foreign output claimed by a country's, should be I guess country's residents should be plural there. I apologize. But anyway, so it's this idea that not only is it the domestic wealth created, which is what GDP captures, but it's also about the foreign. So trying to get at this idea of what are the individuals as a whole doing. And so again, it gets a little bit closer to the idea of the income per person, whereas the GDP was a little bit lacking in that particular area. But obviously, the higher the GNI, the higher this idea of income per person in a country, obviously the greater wealth there is in the country, the greater access to things like healthcare and education and leisure time and healthy foods and travel. And so obviously that's going to be a good indicator of development. Now, when we talk about other economic indicators, there's another one that's what's called PPP, or purchasing power parity. And this helps us to understand a little bit better of the relative wealth of people within countries, because we're looking at the country's currency and its purchasing power in another country. And so even if you might have a relatively high GNI, but what you want to look for a lot of times in comparison is you want to look for that country's GNI and PPP, or purchasing power parity, because it'll give you an indicator of the GNI versus other currency, and how strong would that, or how much would that amount of money get you in another country's currency. And typically it's up against the dollar, which is the world's reserve currency as of right now. Now there are problems with using the GNI as well as GDP. It doesn't give you the whole picture. Now, it will give you a broader picture than the GDP, because again, it brings in foreign income. But one of the things it doesn't capture is the informal sector, and the informal sector becomes more important the less developed the country becomes, because typically the poorer the people are, the more things they're trying to do in order to support themselves economically. Not only that, the poorer the government is, and the harder time the government has in tracking the different transactions and the different financial activities that people are participating in. And in fact, so in some countries, especially again low developed countries, the informal sector actually might be more important than the formal sector. So basically what the informal sector is, it's any economic activity that is not recorded or reported to the government. And so, this could be a lot of different things. Typically, we think about illicit drug activity. We think about things like prostitution, the sex trade. We think about pirated electronics and DVDs and things along those lines, which, certainly they could be the black market type situation. But it could also be small things, people doing work, side jobs, babysitting, grass cutting. And of course, if that's just teenagers, not that big of a deal. But if we're talking about whole systems that are set up around that, that creates more of a problem. Now, the informal sector again is important, because what it does is it meets a demand for a certain segment of the population, and again, it provides income for people in that country. And typically, the informal sector is going to provide goods that are less expensive, and so it's going to meet the demand of typically the lower segments of society in terms of income. That's all that we have time for today, except for a very fast quiz ferret. Quiz ferret, our dear quiz ferret furry friend, has popped his head out of the ground. He has a question for us, and for once, it's going to be about this video that we're working on right now. So the question that quiz ferret has for us is, what is the purpose of the HDI, or the Human Development Index? So pause your video, take a second, take a guess. Answer is to give us a quantifiable measure of development for comparison. And again, we want to move beyond this idea. It's not just about comparison, but it's basically looking at, once we've compared the countries, we think about, well, what can we do to improve the developmental condition of the countries that are in those lower ranges of development. Well, that's all that we have time for. That's all that we have time for today. I appreciate you watching. Of course, if you have any questions, leave those in the comment box below, and I hope to see you next time.